My guest today has one of the most improbable backstories in science. Vivienne Ming was told as a kid she'd win a Nobel Prize, then flunked out of college and spent years homeless living in her car. She came back to finish a 4-year degree in 15 months, earn a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, build a string of AI companies, and transition to living as herself along the way. Today, she's a theoretical neuroscientist who actually measured what happens in your brain when you work with AI. And she found that most people get dumber with it, while a few get dramatically smarter. In this conversation, she explains how you can collaborate with AI so that the two of you together are smarter than either of you alone. Let's get into it. Vivienne Ming, welcome to What is Mind.
It's great to be here with you. I look forward to chatting.
A recent study of yours seems to indicate that AI makes most people think less and a tiny sliver of people think better. Could you talk a little bit about that study?
Yeah, I mean, again, this comes back to the reality that we keep somewhat lazily thinking of human experience as one size fits all. There's an average human, and that is their experience. And in reality, we can look at all sorts of phenomenon, like the internet and social media, mobile phones and automated navigation, and now not just AI, but most specifically, obviously, these agentic models that don't require an expert to build. And I mean, they require an expert to build them, but then anyone can interact with them. So what we see again and again across all of these different domains is they tend to exacerbate differences that already exist in the world. Some of those differences are sort of genetic, biological. Some of them are developmental. What kind of neighborhood did you grow up in? What is the background of your parents? And cultural. And some of them are contextual in the moment. So in this experiment that you're referring to, I asked a bunch of very smart students at UC Berkeley to make predictions about the future. And these predictions were taken off of a site that, when I did this, not many people had heard of, called Polymarket. Today, Polymarket and Kalshi and other prediction markets are more well known. And most people are using these websites to bet on just absurd things, like how many times will Elon Musk tweet in the next week, or I've literally, the founder of Kalshi said she started it because she wanted to be able to bet on the romantic life of the Kardashians, which, wow, what an amazing use of capital and human cognitive function. It's just a little heartbreaking, to be honest, but these sites exist, and there
Right.
are some important questions there where people are actually investing money in the way they invest in stock markets, like what will the price of oil be in 6 months? Will there be a new front in the war in Ukraine? And so I took questions like that. I had my students make predictions, and it turns out they are terrible at it. Even these very smart kids, they're non-experts. It's not like they're energy sector economists or foreign policy experts. And so their predictions were above chance, but they really were not very good. Then I had Gemini 3, which at the time was the state-of-the-art model that had come out, and GPT, as well as a couple of small open source models, Gorn and Llama for the geeks out there that really want to know. And I had them predict the future on these questions. Much better. The worst performing model did dramatically better than the best human beings. And if that was the end of the story, then we're sort of done. The better the model did on the standard benchmarks that are used by the industry to assess model performance, then the better they did in predicting the future, and all of them did better than the best human beings. I don't mean, their average is better than the best human average. The worst model is dramatically better than the best human being. But that's not really what interests me. And it's not what we really talk about when we look at the effect of AI out in the world, which is what happens when humans and AIs interact. In which case, that's where the messy story comes back in. We have this incredibly complex product, AI. There's a lot of underlying technologies and science beneath them. But AI as a concept now is a product. And then we have this even more complex thing, human beings interacting with it. Are we shocked? The result is something that is even more complex than either one. And to dramatically oversimplify, we found in the largest single population of the participants in my experiment, they basically just shut their brain off. We measure an indicator of cognitive effort, gamma band activity. It drops dramatically in this population, which gives me real concerns about things like dementia and Alzheimer's, but that's for the future. We called these groups automators because all they did is they asked, hey, GPT, what will the price of oil be in 6 months? And then they copied that, they pasted it into the answer prompt, and they were done. So that was the single largest group of participants. And again, these are very smart, elite university students. And they are effectively a slow copy-paste function that needs health insurance. So terrible for humanity. There are other populations, but they also did poorly in this. Then we come to this last group, the smallest group in my study, but the one that's hopeful. In fact, the one that is exciting. I call them cyborgs, not simply because I'm a science fiction nerd, but because that's sort of become a bit of a term of art in the field. Because when you look at their interactions with the AIs they were working with, you couldn't tell who made the prediction. So we call this hybrid intelligence. It's not artificial. It's not just natural human intelligence. It's something unique that emerges when high human capital interacts with these agentic AIs, and the humans in these, they would explore, what about this? What about that? And the AI would sort of pull back to the data. And the humans would say, okay, but what about this? After a couple of rounds of that, our little cyborg teams would make predictions. They were better than the best humans. They were better than the best AIs. And they were just shy of the experts betting millions of dollars of this on Polymarket. So in 1 hour, they made 10 predictions. These kids that didn't know anything, like the smartest thing on the planet is that cyborg hybrid intelligence. And that is incredibly exciting. But I think what is most interesting is what predicted it, which wasn't the benchmarks. The benchmarks perfectly predicted the performance of the AIs by themselves. But it actually didn't matter very much if our cyborg teams had a small open source model or the big cutting edge models. They did pretty much equally well. So the predictors were fluid intelligence, curiosity, perspective taking, a social skill, and intellectual humility. Fundamentally human factors. And so I think this really points to something new, which is we are so focused, we as a technology industry are so focused on these benchmarks. How well can AIs answer questions all by themselves? When it turns out the most exciting thing and the thing we should be focusing on is, are we building AIs that actually get the most out of humans? And because that turns out to be the best and most, certainly the most innovative result possible. And again, this just is not being focused on in industry. It's not being focused on by policymakers. And when you hear university students booing people speaking at their, commencement ceremonies as they graduate, I'm genuinely with them that they're being pitched these pretty utopianist stories about AI, which probably aren't true. I'm equally scornful of the dystopianists. I'm a realist. What's going on in the world today? But some of this needs to point back at the students themselves. Did you just go to university to get a high-paying job? I mean, I'm sure that's true of many people. But it turns out, again, in a hard number sense, that's probably not the value add of university. Honestly, ask yourself, if what you can do can be replaced by this almost for free, isn't it somewhat amazing to be freed from just being a crappy robot and
Mm,
then instead to be asked to do a very different job, which is somewhere over there. There are things we don't understand. Help us go figure that out.
mm,
That's the job of the future
mm,
for most of us, or at least that's the job that is in demand. And, to finish this particular ramble, we are not investing in education systems that will deliver that into the next generation. We are not hiring for this. Our management structures are not set up
mm.
so that the AIs themselves, the human capital, and the management and policy, none of these are aligned realistically with the future that's coming, which could be amazing, but we're not pointed in the right direction right now.
Your student subjects were doing a certain kind of thinking. They were making predictions. Another kind of thinking is writing. And I think it's unfortunate that writing with AI has become somewhat stigmatized, just because I think that if you see it as something shameful, you're going to go away from that collaboration and perhaps collaborate in a dumb way, be one of the automators you talk about. So I want to kind of share my process for writing, and I want you to critique it, or perhaps tell us a little bit about how you work with AI in your everyday life and
Absolutely.
your everyday writing. I start out with some sort of stress testing of the thesis, a little research on AI. But there comes a point where I kind of have to say, okay, I'm taking it from here and I'm going to do a draft, and that's going to be me doing the writing. The one exception there is I will use AI as a thesaurus, because AI beats the hell out of any thesaurus I've ever seen. It goes to context, it's great. But the whole first draft is mine. Then I go back to the AI and I say, look, critique this for structure, for argument, and give me just a 30,000 feet view of this, a critique of this. And then it'll come back
Yeah.
with some really great suggestions, like suggestions that you'd expect from the smartest colleague you've had. And then I work through those changes. I get some other ideas during the way. And then the final bit is when I take the Word document, I take it to Claude and I say, Claude, give this back to me in Word with track changes. So then I don't need to do any comparing. I can just accept changes or reject changes. And I have to say, Claude is pretty good about respecting my voice. The other two are a little bit more aggressive than I'd like,
Claude is
and
the
they sort of
best
even it out
writer.
too
It has
much.
its imperfections, but it's the best writer.
Yeah. So tell me, and also you were talking about education. So take this to education, if you like. How should we work with students who are being asked to write? How do you write?
Yeah, while I understand people trying to forward the advice of we need like AI breaks or don't use it at all, I am very much not an advocate for that. Again, if you look at my research and the research of others, what you find is that, hey, even if we look at kids and social media, yeah, it is clearly to me an unambiguous negative to the majority of kids. But what's most interesting to me is some kids show real evidence that social media is a positive aspect in their lives. And the definer is how they use it. I'll sort of keep this not too technical, but in classic psychology, there's a difference between what we call shallow depth of processing and deep processing. Somewhat similar to Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And when we look at these kids on social media, most of them are shallow most of the time. And it really seems to hurt them. It trains their brain to be shallow. But these other kids, without any special prompting, even though the algorithms are truly designed to promote shallowness, they push back against it
Mm,
and they go deep.
mm,
They're on Instagram and they're looking things up that are related to the picture that grabbed their attention. Not all the time, but clearly often enough to matter, which really matches the cyborgs in our experiment. Like, they're using the exact same underlying AI products, Gemini and Claude and GPT, but the people that sort of go into cyborg mode, they are pushing back against the AI's recommendation, not blindly, but constructively and thoughtfully. But they're also asking the AI to push back against them. Here's what I think. Don't tell me why I'm right, which, boy, Gemini in particular is thrilled to tell you why you're right. GPT also. And I suspect X, or whatever the hell Musk
Grok.
loves to tell him he's right. That seems to be the entirety of its fine tuning, is to tell Elon Musk that he's right. So instead, they say, tell me why I'm wrong. So in fact, I love the way you're framing this. Instead of saying don't use AI or take breaks from it or step away, we should be focusing on both the technical challenge of building models that give you what you need and not what you want. That shallow thing in the moment. Write it for me. Have it be done. In our experiment, we actually had one final condition where we took the worst performing model and we trained it to never give answers. And we called it Socrates. And every student, every single one, hated using Socrates. They just wanted an answer. Even the cyborgs sometimes just wanted an answer. And it would say, oh, the price of oil in 6 months? Well, you should probably think about this, and you might want to read that, and here's some questions you should ask yourself. And yet, Socrates had the highest average hybrid intelligence of any model, even though it failed every benchmark and failed when it had to do our task independently because it wouldn't provide answers. So we can change the AI to get more. You want feedback on your writing? Here's feedback. I have been fine-tuned to never write for you, but here I'm your editor. In fact, what's amazing about AI is instead of one editor, you can embody it and say, you're a highly critical editor. You're an editor that loves the ideas but wants to change the language. Here, you're an editor that's bored and doesn't get why it's, in other words, you can evoke all of these different loyal oppositions, if you will. So I use a really strong one. I write about it in my book. Forgive me for being so direct, but here we go. Robot Proof, which I was completely blown away when the Financial Times chose it as one of their books of the summer. But in it, I talk about the nemesis prompt. As I wrote that very book, I would finish a chapter without any AI support. My style has changed as it sort of matured about the AI and my process with AI. But at the time I wrote it, I would write raw chapters, not entirely unlike you. I'd sort of stream of consciousness. What is everything I want to say? What are some good turns of phrases I really like? I have a very distinct voice. Trust me, if you do actually read the book, it is a highly opinionated and highly voiced book by design. If you just want a bunch of right answers, you don't need me. But they're free in your pocket now. What would only Vivienne Ming say? But then I would take it and I would give it to Gemini. At the time I was using Gemini heavily because it's very good on biological models. And I would say, you are my nemesis, my lifelong enemy. You have found every mistake I've ever made and pointed it out to the world. Here's the new chapter I wrote in my book. Tell me in detail why I'm wrong and what I can do to improve it. And I think one of the important things is even then, I didn't simply change everything it pointed out. As they would sometimes say at writers in Hollywood, you look for the note behind the note. You didn't like that character and you wanted to do something different. I'm hearing you, but it turns out the character is structurally important. So there's something about the relationship. Let me change that. You don't think the research supports the claim I'm making and you want me to take it out? I'm hearing the note behind the note, but I think you're missing the broader scope of research. So what I'm understanding is I need to build this argument more cleanly. So even with the super genius AI doing the critique, the point was always, it's my voice which is most precious, and it are my ideas, even if they're wrong. In a world virtually free answers, It is our unique voice, which literally genuinely makes us valuable. I even have an equation associated with that in the book. It's one of the few equations in the book, if that scares you. And so I tried to live that, write the book that only I would write. And I think you're getting into some of the more advanced realities of agentic AI, which was more of an emergent concept at the time I was writing my book, but now it has so many tool sets. It can produce a Word document, enter in, it can draw on tools for doing complex computational modeling or code building that it couldn't have done even just a couple of years ago. So now you have these LLMs that are like an interface into a broader world of artificial intelligence. Leverage them as much as possible, but with one, let me make it a game. Ask it for help. And once it gives you its strongest recommendation, try to figure out a different and better way to do what it's telling you. Just to give you a concrete in a slightly different domain, you've cracked open Google Maps. You've asked it, how do I get from Charles de Gaulle Airport to the Eiffel Tower? And it gives you almost certainly the right answer. If you got a little time, though, think to yourself, what do I know about me, about Paris, and about people that I can get from where I am to the Eiffel Tower by taking a different route, and I can beat it there? You probably won't, but give yourself the challenge. When it says you should change this section of your essay, or you shouldn't use this term, here, read that note behind the note, but find your own path forward. I will also note, sometimes we aren't under control of this. I have published lots of op-eds since my book came out. I feel like I've written more op-eds than I've sold copies of the book. Not true, but it feels that way sometimes. And I noticed that one of the published versions of the op-ed had a really distinctive Claudism in it, which is it said something like, the thing that has been sitting with me. I went back and checked my draft. I never used that phrase in my original longer draft, but the editor needed to trim it down to fit the word length. And I strongly suspect they gave it to Claude and said, keep the voice, keep it as much as possible, but trim 200 words. And it stuck that phrase in. Certainly without me noticing it, because I never saw it go to before it went to press, maybe without the editor noticing as well. But just keep in mind, there's a lot of ways for things to creep in where it becomes less you and more the same old thing anyone else would write. So you also have to really keep an eye on the process as you go, because it is a genuine slippery slope, because it feels so easy, but it's not just lazy. It's not just a laziness that drives people to outsource their cognition to these models. You actually quickly come to think of its capabilities as your capabilities. It's just a very natural aspect of human cognition. This same thing emerges with Google searches. Ask people to do a Google search. They get things right. Then ask them if they can do the same thing next week, but without Google's help. And as silly as it sounds, most people will say yeah, because you quickly internalize these capabilities of your own. And so you really have to monitor that very, very strongly.
Well, I was recently listening to a podcast, and there were 3 writers on it, and they were all kind of saying, well, one of them said, and the other 2 agreed. Sometimes when I come to something weird, something kind of idiosyncratic in my writing that I might have deleted before, now knowing that there's all this AI writing out there, I'm going to keep it in, just as a mark of me, if you will. And I wonder what you think about this. I feel sometimes that we're a little desperately seeking our human comparative advantage. And I'm sure a lot of it will not be intellectual. It might be things like relational, but there is something intellectual that I think humans have that LLMs don't and might never have. I think there is some insight that we get from being embodied. So I
Yeah.
guess I wonder, do you think that there's a danger that we might kind of drift into this sort of arbitrary weirdness?
In modern labor economics, we have, for understandable reasons, thought about human capital almost entirely in terms of how much education you have. More years of education kind of strongly correlates with more pay, and you read papers still today. Everything is about tasks and skill levels. What's interesting is that's a real dimension of human variability, but it turns out AI is relatively insensitive to that. In other words, if there's enough data on a given task, then whether it's doing something that requires 20 years of intensive education or something that requires no years of education, they're all kind of equally difficult, you might say, to most machine learning based AI systems. So the real interesting dimension today, and that concept of relative advantage, plays out in a vaguely correlated but distinct dimension, which is well-posed versus ill-posed problems. Well-posed, we've studied the question for years. There's lots of data on it. We know the answer or the equation or the algorithm to get the answer. A lot of problems of economic interest are well-posed. So we can build equations around these. We just, they have a little layer of the uncertain and ill-posed. Forget the right answers. We don't even know what the right questions are, which meant, hey, if you wanted to analyze a spreadsheet, traditionally, you still had to have a human actually run the algorithm that does it. Well, it simply isn't true anymore. Agentic AI is dramatically better than often the very best human beings at well-posed problems. And so that relative advantage, I have a lot of education, doesn't mean anything. So we are terrible at ill-posed problems. Humans are terrible at dealing with uncertainty. We're terrible at exploring the unknown. And yet, it is our overwhelming relative advantage. So in my experiment, note what I described in our cyborgs. The humans explored the possibilities. The AI pulled back towards the data.
Mm.
And that produced far and away the best results. So this is interesting because it relates to another area of research. I write about it a bit in the book, and this is the problem of innovation. We ask people, independent of AI, ask people to come up with novel ideas. But it turns out the way we structure rewards in companies or in markets, provably the optimal thing to do is as soon as anyone has found a good enough answer, everyone should just herd around it. Obviously, that's not good collectively because it means people are not exploring enough. But it is the literal right thing to do. And as it turns out, we already see evidence of this in science. A research group in China did a massive scale analysis of every scientific paper published over the last several years and then quantified the impact of AI use, right? Intuited from the very variables you were talking about. And what they found is AI is great for scientists. They publish more, they get more citations, it accelerates their career. Every scientist should be using AI. AI is bad for science. Fields of subdisciplines of science that show higher AI usage shows less innovation, lower levels of novelty and new ideas, and fewer breakthroughs
Mm.
because everyone ends up converging on the same questions, which then takes me back to what you were saying. People throwing in little idiosyncratic turns of phrase, apart from the fact that as long as you're getting the syntax right and everything, I kind of enjoy reading something and saying, this, I know this writer.
Mm.
At one point, the sort of famous U.S. film critic Roger Ebert said, The point of a good critic isn't to be right. The point of a good critic is to have a clear perspective so when they offer you a critique, you can then make your own judgment. It meant something to you. We're not
Mhm.
deciding for you whether it's funny movie or a well-acted movie. What we're telling you is how it affected us so that you can then interpret it on your own. In this research on innovation, what they found was if you change the incentives, everyone's going to publish their science papers. They're going to make their predictions of the future, like in my experiment. But you don't get a bonus for being right. It's not a market where you share in the returns. We're going to do something different called minority opinion. You only get a payoff if you were right when the majority was wrong.
Mm.
And it immediately changes people's behavior. What people think is, well, that's almost certainly the right answer is X, but it's obviously the right answer, especially now when you know everyone else has the same right answer. So what I know about X is I get nothing for betting on it. So instead, people start saying, what do I know about this problem that nobody else knows?
Mm.
And eventually, they arrive at Y and Z and triple Z. And what's clear is they think this probably isn't the right answer, but it is the best unique answer I can provide. And I think the most important thing of this whole long story is it actually dramatically improves the performance of the whole prediction market when you change the incentives that way, which is an
Mm.
incredibly long-winded way of saying if you went beyond simply quirky turns of phrase and really thought, what novel ideas am I bringing to the marketplace of ideas right now? Not perversely so. I
Mm.
truly believe in this, but what I believe is of all the ideas only I would come up with,
Mm.
this is the one I think is probably the most valuable. We need that. It drives innovation, it drives novelty, and over-reliance on AI, even by very sophisticated actors like scientists, does the exact opposite.
Let me kind of push a little bit further on this distinction between a well-posed question and an ill-posed question. A well-posed question would be 2 + 2 = 4, right? A definitive question, definitive answer. One example of an ill-posed question would be if I asked you, how can I make my marriage better? It just kind of depends on what I consider to be a good marriage, right? But I guess I wonder that's ill-posed because of the parameters of the question. But say another question like, how can you improve the GDP of Kenya as much as possible? That seems to me to have indefinite answers because the data is not conclusive. It's very complex, very multifactorial. That would be an ill-posed question too, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And perhaps
I
the
think
perhaps the human advantage you're talking about might be some kind of knowledge about Kenya, that Kenyan culture that isn't captured in any LL.
it's not unreasonable to look at the ill-posed and instead of treating it as like a dice roll to really understand that it's more like weather,
Hmm.
a big chaotic system that's very hard to predict. And, you know, an even more direct version of what you were saying about a marriage is why is it that having a high IQ or a high G doesn't seem to correlate with happiness?
Hmm.
To which I would argue, and inspired by a wonderful blog post someone wrote a while ago, maybe we're measuring intelligence wrong. Or rather, what we're measuring is sort of well posed your intelligence, your ability to
Hmm.
answer this. Because again, much like the benchmarks with AI, most of how we have traditionally measured this stuff is with explicitly right and wrong answers. The questions could be very complex, but they have known right answers. So that's how we measure intelligence. Well, it turns out if I am unhappy, how I find happiness is an ill-posed problem. It's different for me than it is for someone else. It's different for me right now, than it would have been 3 years ago. Or right now, because now we're headed towards the afternoon post-lunch and other factors are coming into play, we're moving into the space of the ill-posed. I virtually guarantee you that if we were measuring intelligence more in our ability to deal with ill-posed questions, we'd see a much stronger correlation between
Mm.
that and we even have to redefine intelligence, happiness. Are we talking about hedonic happiness, where you're just stuffing your face with your favorite treat and watching
Mm.
trashy television? Or are we
Mhm.
talking about eudaimonic happiness, which is more like the sense of a job well done? Well, that latter predicts positive life outcomes, and the former predicts negative health outcomes. So, again, messy, complex realities here.
Mhm.
So, my ability, by the way, interesting question you brought up, because I actually got consulted by the Education Ministry of Kenya about, we just did everything the World Bank says. Our students' test scores are the highest they've ever been on the classic PISA international exam system. Still, no one's hiring Kenyans. So we looked at a much messier measure of human capital, which was complex language comprehension. So
Mm.
reading challenging essays and understanding what they're trying to say. There is a bit of a wrong and right part of that, a bit of a well posed, but also a bit of an ill posed. There's different rational interpretations of this.
Mhm.
And it turned out that they'd raised a generation of kids that could give you the right answer to an explicit question. And when you said, interpret this essay, they just fell apart.
Mm.
Modern jobs, not the ones that I am honestly begging the world to part with, but my job for the last 30 years has been, Dr. Ming, my child is dying and none of the doctors can figure it out. Dr. Ming, we do everything the World Bank says and none of our citizens are getting hired. Dr. Ming, we have bias in our promotion system, but we can't actually model the economic consequences. Help us figure out how to solve this. And trust me, no one comes to the crazy lady first. So the one benefit I get in my work is I know any problem that comes to me, everything we think we know about this problem must be wrong or it wouldn't still be a problem. Well, I'm saying more jobs in our economy should be like my job, if only because we don't need all the known stuff. I'm happy to talk to you about the brain.
Mm.
I've got PhDs related to that, but open up your phone and have a conversation with Gemini first. It will give you truly solid answers. I chat with Claude and Gemini about the brain all the time, and I'm notionally an expert.
Mm.
So that well-posed, ill-posed split really starts to point us to, if our relative advantage is in the ill-posed and the exploration, the world needs me to be me
Mm.
in the best sense, then a real change needs to happen from policy levels all the way down to, pedagogy with little kids in school.
So you were talking about curiosity before and novelty, seeking novelty. It reminded me of an anecdote in Brian Christen's book, The Alignment Problem, where he talks about these computer scientists that are developing programs to beat video games. And eventually with one, they come to a sort of an obstacle that this game isn't being won with just straight up rewards of success. And the computer scientists need to put in a curiosity utility factor in there so that the system is going to explore the environment and get some reward from that so that it can go on and win that level. And I found it fascinating that they connected that with dopamine in the brain. And, that people had been confused as to why dopamine comes so early. Everybody thought it was a reward function, but then they thought, well, maybe there's a layer to dopamine that's about curiosity, that's about looking for novelty. And that kind of parallel fascinates me. And I'm wondering, as a neuroscientist that is also very involved in thinking about AI, obviously the mind and computers are very different, right? But do you see a prospect of some kind of convergence, some kind of us learning about ourselves by looking at these machines?
Yes, although here's a spot where a little historical perspective on both AI and neuroscience is kind of needed, because we're talking in particular about a specific form of machine learning called reinforcement learning. It won the Nobel Prize for AlphaFold, the protein folding algorithm developed at DeepMind, which is a reinforcement learning models. So what's important to understand is we came to understand how to build artificial reinforcement learning models by studying how rats solve maze. And that has been going on for decades and decades. And so the basic form of what we discovered, to riff on Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman's saying, if you can't build it, you don't understand it. So
Mm,
some of these things we think about human behavior and animal behavior, it seems so obvious. How do you solve a maze? Well, you wander around until you find the cheese, and then you just do the right thing again. Well, how would you build that? Oh, well, that's if I only get the cheese at the end, and let's say it comes with a reward, then how do I know when I start at the beginning again whether to turn left or right? And what they found was the more the rat trains, you see lots of very effortful activity in its prefrontal and hippocampus, and it's exploring, 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 and then bam, when it finds the cheese the first time, big dopamine reward. So yeah, the misapprehension, which isn't in the neuroscience world, but somehow has permeated our public understanding of dopamine, is it's a reward. You found cheese, you got dopamine. If you want a reward, we have endogenous opioids. And if opioids sound familiar to you, like opium, you got it. It makes us feel good. Dopamine doesn't actually make us feel good. All dopamine seems to signal is there seems to be something worth investigating just over there. Do that thing again because it seems to have produced something interesting. And so what it turns out is the next time the rat is wandering through that maze and it finally recognizes, wait a minute, this is close to where the cheese is, bam, dopamine. Then, not when it finds the cheese. And the
mm,
more you train the rat, the further, eventually you put it in front of the maze. Soon as it recognizes the maze, bam, dopamine.
mhm.
And if it gets to the middle and there's no cheese, dopamine drops. So you get a little sort of negative dopamine response. And that's really useful because people talk about things. I spoke earlier about not wanting to take breaks from AI because that's only true if you think AI is the problem or social media is the problem. Social media, the way it's been designed, is meant to promote really short dopamine loops. One single turn, i.e., go to the next picture, the next video, the next post, and immediately get a dopamine response. Short time loops, tau, as we'd call it. But actually, when you look at really high human capital students, as my wife and I did in a study 15 years ago, what we found is one of the biggest predictors of which students not only get a good grade in the class, but would graduate the fastest, get the best jobs, and have the best careers were they regularly wrong? Not wrong because they didn't understand the problem, but wrong because they would explore beyond their knowledge. Say, get up in class and say, what about this? And what's interesting, I can't literally say this because needless to say, we weren't jamming wires into the heads of human beings in classrooms, but I virtually guarantee you, when they got up and asked the question and discovered they were wrong, they probably got a dopaminergic release because suddenly they have discovered a misconcept that they had. And their brain is predicting, based on their personal history, Now I can explore that and learn something new.
Hmm.
So in other words, instead of a short time loop, here the dopamine is predicting a long period of effort, like solving a whole maze is going to pay off. But we only see it in that minority of students. And similarly with my experiment with the students that were putting in all of the effort going into cyborg mode, but they got the better results. What you see is very quickly learning itself is being rewarded, and it drives curiosity. So what we've known for a long time in reinforcement learning models is you need to have a parameter that models exploration versus exploitation. How much are we going to keep doing the same thing that worked in the past? How much are we going to try something new? Because we see essentially, even in bees, going out and looking for pollen, they dynamically, almost optimally, change some hidden internal neural parameter they have, even in their tiny little brains or ganglionic structures, to optimally. If there's a perfect warm spring and lots of flowers, they explore more to look for the better ones. If things are getting rough and they're not getting lit, they go back to that same flower that keeps delivering over and over again. Bees show this trade-off. Well-built RL models do, rats do, human beings do as well, but we're all different. So that parameter in each of us, tuned by genetics and by life and by our peers around us. If your peers are exploring more, you explore more. And if
Mm.
they're conservative and risk averse, so are you. And if your teachers praise right answers over interesting questions, then exploitation, 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 no exploration,
Mm.
you generate an entire generation of kids that don't know how to do the very thing that the world is demanding of them today.
I think perhaps one of the downfalls of being an author like yourself is that you're always talking about the book you were working on 2 years ago, and you're
Sure.
probably thinking about something new now. So I want to ask you, what are you thinking about these days?
Well, if anyone's watching the video version of this, you will see some posters behind me, one of which is for my current book, but the two others are for some upcoming books. I really wrote one giant million-word book. It turns out nobody really wants to publish a million-word book. In fact, turns out nobody wants to publish anything longer than 70,000 words anymore. And so as I knew I would have broken it up into 3 books. If those 3 books all were one book and they had one title, it would just be Build Better People.
Mm.
My existing book, Robot Proof, is building better people in the context of AI and the future of work. And my next 2 books, The Tax on Being Different, is in the context of society, with chapters on the neuroscience of trust and why how people's belief in how their hard work will pay off plays out across their lifetime. And then finally, the one I've admittedly been thinking about a lot because it's hard not to look at the political framing of the world right now and
Mhm.
think, boy, no matter which side you're on here, something's not working right for us.
Mhm.
And so that book, Small Sacrifices, has a subtitle, which is The Science, Economics, and Story of Purpose. And purpose can be very squishy kind of concept. Again, I'm sort of a hard numbers computational scientist, even though I happen to study people. And so for me, I run experiments and run computational models to understand what I call the purpose paradox, which is, in my research, people that score highly in what's called construct strength of purpose or life meaningfulness. The behavioral evidence of that is that they just help other people. People that score higher in purpose seem to do things that make other people better off without any obvious benefit for themselves. And if you're a liberal economic theorist, you would say, well, that's bad for them because they're not being rationally self-interested. The paradox is that people that score higher in purpose and life meaningfulness live longer, they have more friends, they're happier, they earn more money across their lifetime, they have higher average incomes, Like, think of everything you'd want to be true about you when you're finally a grown up, and it's substantially more likely to be true of people that score highly in purpose. So, why is it that the thing you're explicitly not supposed to do, according to, people at the University of Chicago, actually drives better life outcomes? And having put in some interesting research in this space, it just felt like a book. Originally, it was going to be my last book, but I think the nature of the world right now is understanding both why we are in this moment. So the first half of the book, forgive my foul mouth, but it has its own title, which is Why Do Assholes Rise to the Top? And its own subtitle, which is Why Do We Let Them?
Mm.
And so it explores the sort of dark parts of being a human being. The idea that we are our best selves, but we're also our worst selves, not as a society, as individuals. And I talk about my research where I'm able to get people to do things they had already identified as morally wrong, and they swore they would never do. But then the second half of the book is my response to that, which is all of the ways we can be the best version of ourselves, and what that means economically, and what that means interpersonally, and even what that means politically.
Mm.
So I really try to be grounded in research. That's just my life. I pretend to be an entrepreneur. I love having had written my books. I'm even writing a screenplay right now, believe it or not. But my day job is I am a hard number scientist, and my absurd self-appointed career is to use that in philanthropic research to understand how to build better people.
Mm.
And sharing the stories of that work hopefully has some impact in moving us in that direction. So that's what's in front of me, is
Mm.
something as modest in its ambition as to fix the human condition.
It's good to swing for the fences.
Yeah.
One, one, one final question. I've become sort of a connoisseur of your YouTube talks, and you're a terrific public speaker. And you often end your talks with a sort of humanistic epigram. And I want to read a couple of them to you because they're worth mentioning. One is, if you want an amazing life, you have to give it to someone else. And another one is, make yourself a better person. That is the one thing you can do to make a better world. And it seems to me one is kind of going from the outside looking inside, looking out, and the other one is, make the change by looking in. And I've sometimes thought the challenge of life is to, see what serves other people and find the Venn diagram between that and what resonates in you. I'm wondering how you're thinking, because it seems like this is wrapped up in your project, right? This is very much a sort of like a self and society kind of view. So how do you kind of draw the line between those two epigrams?
I mean, there's a degree to which, to be blunt, putting together a kind of pithy, memorable close to a talk, which I have to say with genuinely some pride. I'm a very extemporaneous speaker, and so every one of those were things I just sort of stumbled across in front of an audience and thought, oh, I kind of like that. It really captures some of what I'm trying to get across, and then have had the chance to use again. But I'm also, what I'm truly trying to do is explain the messy underlying realities of being a human being, but capturing that in as brief a statement as I can make. So if you want an amazing life, you have to give it to someone else, is obviously somewhat implicit in all of my research on construct purpose, which is to say this paradox of people helping others seemingly irrationally, but as a result having better lives for themselves. So we can literally see in massive scale research. Andrew Steptoe publishes on this using data sets from the UK Biobank. So he's looking at the life outcomes of hundreds of thousands of people and seeing life meaningfulness as a huge predictor. And in my book, I talk about a number of similar constructs, like curiosity and perspective taking, that similarly have these really positive aspects. So to me, the real complexity of all of these is we are these messy, dynamical systems. We're not independent of one another. Whether you're focusing on yourself or others, there are feedback loops that play through all of that. I think the terrifying part is if I just said be a better person as a standalone statement, to what? And let the Musks and Trump of the world's defect in the prisoner's dilemma game of life and take everything because I'm such a fool. All of these things to me are sort of fundamentally part of big, complex, dynamical systems. Even when I talk about social media and algorithms and a big project I'm doing on political polarization and the run up to the 2027 French elections, when you look at it, it is the interaction. It's the algorithm and the elites and the consumers. We can complain bitterly about social media, but that's actually the system that exists because we used it.
Hmm.
We could have used different systems that challenge us more and didn't just be a bunch of incendiary firebombs thrown out by people or tiny little sentences that don't explain anything. Those existed. We didn't use them. So owning that as an individual, while also recognizing the algorithm being built by these companies is also part of the problem. And the way elites and their incentives for using it to be incendiary, that's also part of the problem. If you solved any one of those, you haven't solved the fundamental problem of the system. So I'm trying to prevent something that's almost like a Zen koan of start with yourself because you control that. But it really needs to be part of something bigger. Right now, the U.S. is in, and I don't think we're alone here, but it's particularly noticeable in the U.S. They're in cultural studies. There's a really well-known dimension, collectivist versus individualist. America is about as individualist as it gets. Famously, let's say China is much more of a collectivist society, although it turns out that even varies a lot within China and within America. But there's another less well-known, which is tightness versus looseness. How much must people really conform? Collectivist is how much are you a part of a community? What is your responsibility? Is it to myself or is it to the community? Tightness and looseness is how much does community make me conform or celebrate difference? The U.S. is bizarre right now. We're profoundly individualist and tight. You're responsible only for yourself, but you have to be just like everyone else.
Hmm.
It's really unhealthy. And finding some way of understanding my single biggest leverage point in the world is me. What am I doing as a parent? I want my kid to have a better life. What should I do? Be the person I want my child to become. The biggest impact I will ever have on their lives is what I role model for them. By far, maybe other than genetics, but you can't control that after the fact. So be that person. And the wonderful benefit is then you get to be that person. Presumably, that's the person you actually admire. So taking that kind of perspective, that these things are fundamentally in tension. We've bought into this idea that there's one magic answer that will fix everything. That's what sells a lot of, we just need to be more macho, or we just need to be more intellectual, or we just need to collectivize, or be independent, or all of biology, all of the world is allostasis. It's dynamic tension. I know that's not a sexy way of putting it, but it's true.
Yeah.
The only thing you can be confident of is if someone says that they know the one single answer, that they're wrong, because there is no such answer. So in my little pithy statements, I'm trying to evoke that tension. There isn't one right answer. You control yourself, invest there. But it's actually how society changes that creates the big change that you're hoping to evoke. And that tension is just something we need to get more comfortable with.
Vivienne Ming, thank you so much for coming on What is Mind? It's been a fascinating conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.